Chapter 2. The Book of the Watchers and Ascent to Heaven. The Book of the Watchers is not the earliest apocalypse. The astronomical book, also attributed to the patriarch Enoch, preceded it, but it is a good place to begin a discussion of apocalyptic literature. Although its combination of form and content is quite distinctive, it was extremely influential. All later apocalypses involving ascent to heaven are indebted to it either directly or indirectly, as are later apocalypses attributed to Enoch whether they involve ascent or not. Fragments of the original Aramaic of the work are preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and much of the Book of the Watchers is extant in Greek translation, but for the complete work we must rely on the Ethiopic translation of the Greek, in which it appears as chapters 1 to 36 of an anthology of Enochic apocalypses known to scholars as 1 Enoch. As we have seen, the Book of the Watchers as a complete work dates from no later than the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, and perhaps somewhat earlier, but some of the sources on which it drew are considerably earlier, perhaps as early as the end of the Persian period. In other words, the Book of the Watchers took shape during the period of Ptolemaic rule in Judea, a period about which we know very little, and it reached its final form either shortly before or just after Judea fell to the Seleucids. It thus predates the transformative events of the Hellenistic reform and the Maccabean revolt that shaped the Book of Daniel, which are discussed in the next chapter. The point of departure for the Book of the Watchers is the story of the descent of the sons of God to take wives from among the daughters of man, 1 Enoch 6-11, of which Genesis 6:1-4 offers a condensed version. The Book of the Watchers alludes to this enigmatic biblical passage, but it is hard to understand its account as derived solely from exegesis. Rather, the Book of the Watchers appears to be drawing on a larger set of traditions that surface only briefly in Genesis. The biblical narrative hints that the marriage of sons of God and the daughters of man had deleterious consequences for humanity, by placing the story immediately before its account of the flood. In the Book of the Watchers, the devastating effects of this violation of the order of the universe by the sons of God, which it identifies as watchers, a class of angels known to us from the Book of Daniel as well, are quite explicit. The devastation is caused most obviously by the offspring of the divine beings and their human wives, giants with insatiable appetites, who devour not only beasts but humans as well. As human beings cry out in anguish, God sends his archangels to punish the watchers for their transgressions and to bring a flood to cleanse the earth of all the wrongdoing that has taken place upon it, so that it will enjoy peace and fertility forever. Presumably this permanent state of blessedness is intended as description of the distant future, after the last judgment, 1 Enoch 24:3, 26:3, not of the post-flood state of the world. Genesis' story of the descent of the sons of God stands apart from its context. The rest of the primeval history, Genesis 1-11, attempts to explain how the ordered and good world of creation, Genesis 1, became the world as we know it. But all of the other stories firmly place the blame for the sorry state of affairs on humanity: Adam and Eve's disobedience of God's commands, Cain's inability to tolerate God's apparent preference for Abel, and the sins of Noah's generation before the flood, and Ham's violation of Noah's nakedness and the building of the Tower of Babel after the flood. Alone among these stories, Genesis 6:1-4 describes disobedience originating not on earth but in heaven. Indeed, the compression of the narrative may reflect an effort to nod at a well-known legend about the origins of evil in the world, without allowing it to disrupt the biblical account's emphasis on human disobedience by giving it too much attention. The story in the Book of the Watchers, on the other hand, places the origins of the human predicament not in human disobedience, or unwillingness to accept the limits of being human, but rather in divine unwillingness to accept those boundaries. The descent of the Watchers emerges as an alternative to Adam and Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden as the source of evil in the world, with divine beings rather than humans responsible for the introduction of forbidden knowledge. Thus the explanation for the origins of evil in the Book of the Watchers stands in considerable tension with a view that dominates the primeval history of Genesis and the Hebrew Bible more generally. Yet the Book of the Watchers can also be read as moderating this understanding of the origins of evil. After the account of the marriages of the Watchers to women and the destruction wrought by their fearsome offspring, there comes a list of Watchers and the skills or knowledge each one revealed to humanity. The negative consequences of some of the skills, such as the arts of war, are evident, but others, such as metalworking and the manufacture of cosmetics, are basic to civilization. Some types of knowledge, such as knowledge of the cutting of routes and interpreting the signs of the heavens, are closely connected to magic and the supernatural world. The list implies that knowledge that should not have been revealed to human beings is to blame for what went wrong on Earth. The list apparently derives from a different source from the account that blames the Watchers' marriages and the giants who result from them, though the Book of the Watchers has made some effort to integrate the two explanations. The first angel mentioned on the list, Asahel, is said to have revealed the arts of war, jewelry making, and the making of cosmetics. In its only comment on the Angelic Revelations, the Book of the Watchers notes here that the sons of men began to make these items for themselves and their daughters, so that their daughters led the holy ones astray. 1 Enoch 8:1. If the narrative of chapters 6 to 8 is read chronologically, the revelation of forbidden knowledge follows on the Watchers' descent for purposes of marriage. But the Book of the Watchers comment suggests another reading. In this reading, chapter 8 becomes a sort of flashback that implies that with the revelation of techniques of beautification to humanity, women used those techniques to seduce the angels, thus bringing about the birth of the giants and the havoc that they caused. In this understanding of the origins of evil, the transgressions of the Watchers came first, but human beings were quick to follow, with the behavior of women then contributing to the further transgressions of the Watchers. The power of the story is clear. It absolves humanity of the blame, or, in the reading that places the revelation of knowledge first, some of the blame, for the evils around us. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, the Book of Jubilees had added to the story an element that became extremely popular: the survival of the spirits of the giants after the death of their bodies as demons that lead humanity astray and cause human misfortune. The idea of demons as the result of the marriage of watchers and women proved extremely fruitful. The 2nd century Christian apologist Justin Martyr, for example, suggested that the gods worshipped by pagans were the fallen watchers and their demonic offspring, Enoch and the calendar. The Book of the Watchers introduces its hero at the very beginning, 1 Enoch 1-5, where he offers a speech about the last judgment that contrasts the faithfulness of nature with the faithlessness of humanity. But Enoch is notably absent from the story of the descent of the Watchers, a clear indication that this story developed independently of Enoch traditions. The connection is established by the authors of the next unit, 1 Enoch 12-16, like the authors of the narrative of the descent of the Watchers. They drew on traditions that stand behind a passage in Genesis as well as on the passage itself. The passage from Genesis relevant to this unit of the Book of the Watchers is the brief notice of the extraordinary career of the patriarch in Genesis 5:21. The other patriarchs who form the links in the genealogies of the primeval history live a certain number of years, beget their first son, live many years more, beget more sons and daughters, and die. Not so Enoch. After begetting Methuselah, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Genesis 5:24, at the youthful age, by antediluvian standards, of 365. The number of years of Enoch's life on earth points to the calendar, and though Enoch's association with the calendar is only hinted at in the Book of the Watchers, it is central to the earlier astronomical book. The astronomical book consists of a detailed account of the movements of sun and moon, presented as a revelation to Enoch by the angel Uriel. The Aramaic fragments show that the Ethiopic is an abridgment of an even longer original. The work demonstrates how the movements of the moon can be coordinated with the 364-day year it attributes to the sun, but it makes no mention at all of such obvious Jewish calendrical concerns as the Sabbath or the festivals. It is matter-of-fact in tone even in its criticism of those who fail to add a day between each of its 90-day quarters, thus producing a year of only 360 days. The only passage in which the rhetoric becomes more heated is one that blames the sins of humanity for the failure of the heavenly bodies to appear on time. 1 Enoch 80. This passage is widely regarded as a later addition, and it suggests that advocates of the astronomical book's calendar had come to realize that their 364-day year too was shorter than nature required. Unfortunately, we do not know what kind of calendar was in use in the temple during the early Second Temple period, so it is difficult to say what the astronomical book is responding to. The Torah's festival calendars appear to contain both solar and lunar elements. The celebration of the new month reflects concern for the moon, while festivals linked to the agricultural year require a solar calendar. But it is worth remembering that the Torah's most important calendrical innovations, the Sabbath and the 7-day week, are entirely man-made, with no connection at all to nature. The beauty of the 364-day year is that it consists of exactly 52 weeks, so that the festivals of the biblical calendar fall out on the same day of the week year after year. This is not the case for the 365-day solar calendar, the lunar calendar, or the later rabbinic combination of the two, the one still in use among Jews for religious purposes. The disadvantage of the 364-day year, as the current form of the astronomical book admits, is that it does not correspond to reality, thus gradually pulling the festivals out of alignment with the seasons to which they belong. After the Maccabean revolt in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the temple authorities seem to have made use of a combination solar-lunar calendar. The Book of Jubilees engages in a vigorous polemic against such a calendar in favor of a 364-day calendar, and the Dead Sea Scrolls also subscribe to a 364-day calendar. The dissonance between the 364-day calendar revealed to Enoch in the astronomical book, and Enoch's 365-year lifespan according to the Torah is evident, but it is not clear whether this difference reflects a polemic against a 364-day calendar already associated with Enoch, inserted in a late stage of the editing of the Torah, or simply a variant tradition. Enoch's Ascent and the Heavenly Temple. Enoch makes his appearance in the narrative of the Book of the Watchers when the Watchers who remain in heaven commission him to deliver a message of condemnation to their fellow Watchers who have descended to earth. 1 Enoch 12. Although the Watchers address Enoch by his professional title, scribe, the errand on which they sent him requires him to speak, not to write. But scribal skills are required for the task the fallen Watchers ask him to undertake upon hearing his message, the drawing up of a petition for mercy to be taken before the Lord. Enoch writes the petition, seats himself by the waters of Dan, and proceeds to recite the words of the petition until he falls asleep. 1 Enoch 13. In his sleep he is taken up to heaven to stand before the divine throne. 1 Enoch 14. As we have seen, the Torah notes that God took Enoch, presumably to heaven, and it also describes Elijah's ascent to heaven at the end of his earthly career. But the Book of the Watchers is the first ancient Jewish text to narrate an ascent in detail. In the period of the First Temple, God was understood to be present and available to his people in the Jerusalem Temple. Thus, for example, the prophet Isaiah in the middle of the 8th century BCE describes receiving his commission during an encounter in the temple, where the Lord sits enthroned, surrounded by the heavenly host. The loss of the temple thus meant that God's presence was no longer constantly available in Jerusalem. The chariot throne of Ezekiel's famous vision, composed of four-faced creatures with wheels in place of feet, provides the divine presence, now homeless, with a means of conveyance so that it can travel anywhere it wills, including to Babylonia by the river Chebar, where it appears to Ezekiel. Although the Second Temple had been standing for centuries by the time the Book of the Watchers was composed, it never filled the gap left by the First Temple. The Book of Ezra describes a mixed reaction to the Second Temple from the people assembled as the foundation stone was laid in 520 BCE. While some shouted with joy, those who remembered the First Temple wept. Ezra 3:10-13. Later in the Second Temple period, priests are often accused of polluting the temple. Some texts go so far as to suggest that the Second Temple was polluted from the very start. Thus it is perhaps not surprising that the Book of the Watchers sends Enoch not to Jerusalem but to heaven to find God's presence. Yet heaven, as the Book of the Watchers describes it, turns out to be a temple. Of course, anywhere God dwells is by definition a temple, since house of the Lord is one of the terms by which the Bible refers to the Jerusalem temple. But the ascent of the Book of the Watchers has in mind more than this tautology. When Enoch arrives in heaven, he enters a marvelous building complex composed of fire and ice. But despite the awesome construction materials, which send Enoch into a state of fear and trembling, the structure of the complex, an outer wall and a house within a house, echoes the tripartite structure shared by the wilderness tabernacle of the Torah, the Jerusalem temple of the Book of Kings, and the vision of the restored temple of the Book of Ezekiel. Enoch sees cherubim on the ceiling of the middle chamber of the heavenly building. Cherubim decorate the walls of all three biblical sanctuaries. When Enoch finally reaches the entrance to the inner building, he falls prostrate in awe and fear at the sight he sees there. The Lord, clothed in a brilliant white garment, seated on a throne of cherubim. It is a remarkable sign of Ezekiel's influence on the Book of the Watchers that the throne has wheels despite the fact that it is fixed in heaven. Just as the earthly temple has priests, so too does the heavenly one. Enoch sees a multitude of angels before the divine throne, but only the holy ones of the Watchers are permitted to approach it. Though these angels are not explicitly identified as priests, approach is a technical term for priestly service in the Torah. Further, when God responds to the petition of the fallen Watchers, he begins by rebuking them for asking a human being to intercede on their behalf when it was their duty to intercede for humans. 1 Enoch 15:2. Intercession, mediation between the divine and the human realm, is a priestly task. Though Enoch ascends to heaven in his professional capacity of scribe to deliver the petition he has drawn up, God's words confirm another aspect of Enoch's identity, an aspect implied by his safe progress through the heavenly temple. The Torah cautions that only a priest is permitted to pass beyond the courtyard to the central chamber of the temple where sacrifices are performed. The stranger who approaches shall die. Numbers 18:7. My translation. Thus, though at the time in which the Book of the Watchers is set, there was as yet no temple on earth, and therefore no priesthood. Enoch must nonetheless be a priest as well as a scribe to permit him access to the inside of the heavenly temple. Recall that Ezra the scribe, who established the Torah at the center of Judaism, was also a priest by ancestry. Indeed, the combination of priestly ancestry and scribal profession is not uncommon in the Second Temple period. We left Enoch prostrate before the divine throne, a position from which an angel soon raises him. Now God orders Enoch to tell the watchers that their petition has been rejected and condemns them for abandoning heaven for the sake of their wives. In light of the priestly function of the watchers, some scholars have suggested that this condemnation of the behavior of the watchers is intended to criticize priests of the Jerusalem temple for marrying foreign women. But by the time the Book of the Watchers took shape, foreign women were understood as forbidden to all Jewish men, and such behavior by a significant portion of the priesthood thus seems unlikely. I would suggest instead that the Book of the Watchers was criticizing a practice most Jews and most priests believed was perfectly acceptable: marriage to Jewish women who are not from priestly families. The view that priests should marry only women of priestly ancestry is clearly a minority view, but it is attested in other works found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It appears to be based on a particularly strict reading of the laws of priestly marriage in Leviticus. The fact that some watchers remain in heaven as their fellows descend to earth to marry women suggests that the Book of the Watchers does not view all priests as guilty of wrongdoing. Of course, the parallel between watchers and priests is not perfect. Marriage itself is wrong for the watchers, since, as God notes in his condemnation of the fallen watchers, marriage is unnecessary for immortal beings. Human priests are restricted in their choice of wives, but they are expected to marry. Furthermore, it should be emphasized that the depiction of Enoch as a priest is a strong indication of the high regard in which the Book of the Watchers hold the priesthood as an institution, even if it criticizes actual priests for failing to live up to its standards. Finally, it should be noted that the Book of the Watchers understands Enoch not only as scribe and priest. His vision of God enthroned and his role as God's messenger show clearly that he should be understood as a prophet as well. Thus, according to the Book of the Watchers, Enoch embodies the three central types of religious authority: the journey to the ends of the earth. From his place before the divine throne, Enoch departs on a journey in which he travels to the ends of the earth and sees things inaccessible to other human beings. 1 Enoch 17-36. The journey is actually a combination of two sources. The first, 1 Enoch 17-19, is brief and often opaque. The second, 1 Enoch 20-36, reworks the first, recounting the sights more clearly and at greater length, and adds new sights. The journey to the ends of the earth seems to have taken shape independently of the ascent to heaven and is linked to it only loosely. One of the last sights Enoch sees in the first journey is the place of punishment of the watchers, the place to which he would have to travel to deliver God's response to their petition. 1 Enoch 19, and a very similar version of the watcher's punishment appears again at the beginning of the second account of the journey. 1 Enoch 21. Yet in neither instance does Enoch fulfill the task with which God entrusted him by informing the watchers of the rejection of their petition. Enoch travels to the ends of the earth in the company of the archangels, who serve as his guides, explaining the sights he sees. This is, these are, this place is. These demonstrative explanations, usually in response to Enoch's questions, reflect ancient modes of dream and vision interpretation known from the Hebrew Bible and elsewhere in the ancient Near East. In making use of them, the Book of the Watchers suggests that the sights Enoch sees are also divine revelations. As just noted, both sources of the journey to the ends of the earth include a stop at the place where the watchers endure punishment. In the second source, the reward and punishment of human beings also figures as a central concern, and, shortly after he sees the punishment of the watchers, Enoch is taken to see the chambers in which the souls of the dead are stored as they await the last judgment. 1 Enoch 22. The chamber in which the souls of the righteous are kept has light and a fountain. The other chambers are dark. Soon Enoch comes to a high mountain with a beautiful tree nearby and 6 mountains round it. 1 Enoch 24. At the Ascent, and God will descend to that mountain to judge humanity. The tree, Enoch is told, will then be transplanted to the temple where the righteous will enjoy its fruit. Next Enoch turns to the center of the earth, that is, Jerusalem, where he sees a beautiful mountain covered with trees and a deep and barren valley. 1 Enoch 25-6. The cursed valley is Gehinnom, the valley in Jerusalem in which, according to the prophet Jeremiah, Israelites sacrifice their children to the pagan god Molech. There, after the last judgment, the wicked will suffer their punishment as the righteous look on. The beautiful mountain, presumably the future dwelling place of the righteous, must be Mount Zion. the Temple Mount. These sites are the first clear expression of a belief in post-mortem reward and punishment in Jewish literature. They mark a significant departure from the biblical picture of the dead descending to Sheol, where the righteous and the wicked alike endure a sort of shadow existence. The sites reflect an understanding of the fate of souls after death, as having two stages: storage in the appropriate chamber to await the last judgment, which already constitutes reward or punishment, and then a more intense reward or punishment after the last judgment. The impetus for the new picture can be found in earlier biblical discussion of the fate of the righteous, and the emphasis on the immortality of the soul in some strands of Greek thought may also have had an impact. The other central theme of the second source of the journey is the wonders of nature. After leaving Jerusalem, Enoch travels into the desert to the east, which is full of wonderful spice trees. 1 Enoch 27-31. Finally he comes to the paradise of righteousness, where he sees a large and magnificent tree. 1 Enoch 32. This, the angel explains, is the tree of wisdom from which your father of old and your mother of old, who were before you, ate and learned wisdom. And their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they were driven from the garden. 1 Enoch 32:6. Presumably the author of this portion of the journey felt it impossible to avoid mention of one of the most important locations in Jewish mythic geography, the Garden of Eden, and with it, the story of Adam and Eve's disobedience, but he has done everything he can to minimize its impact. He has already moved the tree of life to a new location, for surely the tree that will provide fruit to the righteous at the eschaton is nothing other than the tree of life. Here, the version of the story of the expulsion from Eden, that the angel offers Enoch in explanation of the tree of knowledge, avoids mentioning that eating from this tree was an act of disobedience. Thus the Book of the Watchers manages to incorporate the dominant biblical story of the origins of evil into its narrative while keeping it subordinate to the story of the Watchers. Enoch continues on his journey, traveling north, west, south, and finally east yet again. As he travels he sees great beasts and birds and also the earthly gates of meteorological and cosmological phenomena, the gates of the stars and the gates of winds and hail, rain, and snow. 1 Enoch 33-36. Upon seeing these wonders, Enoch praises God for creating them. There is no mention of the gates of the sun and moon so central to the calendrical revelation of the astronomical book, and if we had to rely on the Book of the Watchers alone we would have only a few hints of the association of Enoch with the calendar. The idea of the natural world as testifying to the greatness of its creator became particularly important to the Israelites during the Babylonian exile. To those who saw recent events as calling into question God's strength and power, the prophet of 2nd Isaiah asks, "Lift up your eyes on high and see, who created these?" Isaiah 40:26. He is confident of the answer, the same answer offered by one of the Psalms, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims the work of his hands." Psalm 19:1. My translation. This idea is prominent in biblical wisdom works, particularly some of the Psalms and the Book of Proverbs. But there was a more skeptical side to biblical wisdom as well. The Book of Job, written in the wake of the exile, suggests that God's plans are beyond human understanding, and God uses the wonders of nature to silence Job. "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail?" Job 38:4-22. Here the wonders of creation are represented as hidden from human beings just as wisdom is hidden, and God the Creator is under no obligation to explain himself to a mere human being. The Book of the Watchers is neither as optimistic as the psalmist, about the clarity with which nature speaks of its creator, nor as pessimistic as the Book of Job. On the one hand, the sights that Enoch sees are not available to all humanity. I, Enoch, alone saw the visions, the extremities of all things, and no one among humans has seen as I saw, Enoch says at the end of the first journey. 1 Enoch 19:3. On the other hand, God permits the revelation of the wonders of nature to one human being, and through his account the rest of humanity can join in blessing the Lord of glory, who has wrought great and glorious wonders. 1 Enoch 36:4. In contrast to the knowledge revealed to humanity by the Watchers, the wonders revealed to Enoch by the angels lead not to sin and disaster, but to the recognition of God's greatness. Enoch between humanity and the angels. Angels appear in biblical literature from the period of the First Temple as messengers of God and as members of his heavenly entourage. In the period after the exile, angels multiply and become a more central part of the Jewish picture of the world. Before the exile, the visions of the prophets Amos and Jeremiah are interpreted by God himself. After the exile, an angel interprets the visions of the prophet Zechariah. Before the exile, angels remain anonymous, even such outstanding angels as the commander of the Lord's army whom Joshua encounters outside Jericho. After the exile, Satan appears in the books of Zechariah and Job. At this early stage of his development he is merely the accuser, as his name indicates. the prosecuting attorney in the heavenly courtroom rather than an enemy of God and humanity. Not long after, the leading angels are given names: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, and so on, names found in the astronomical book, the Book of the Watchers, Tobit, and other works from before the Maccabean revolt. Sometime after the revolt, the Book of Jubilees offers a list of the various types of angels created on the first day. If God was no longer available in the Jerusalem temple but only in its heavenly counterpart, the proliferation of angels meant that they at least were nearby. But the picture of the universe in the Book of the Watchers is more complicated than the one I have just sketched. One striking aspect is the permeability of the borders between humanity and the divine sphere. The narrative is set in motion when the Watchers cross the boundary by descending to earth with disastrous consequences for themselves and for humanity. On the other hand, in his ascent to heaven and journey to the ends of the earth in the company of the archangels, Enoch crosses the boundary to positive effect. Although these trips lack concrete results other than the rejection of the petition of the fallen Watchers, they reassure readers that God still sits enthroned in heaven, that the heavenly temple continues to function, and that the created world testifies to God's greatness. Perhaps most important, the account of Enoch's ability to mediate between angels and God, to stand before the divine throne, and to be a travel companion to angels tells readers that humanity, or at least one of its outstanding representatives, is the equal of the angels. Though his ability to cross the boundary between the human and the divine spheres does not imply that ordinary human beings can do so, it does serve as an indication of the heights to which human beings can rise. In the end, the Book of the Watchers suggests that angels do not necessarily belong above humanity in the hierarchy of being, and that human contact with God need not be mediated by angels. The milieu of the Book of the Watchers. The Dead Sea Scrolls were the library of a small community at a place called Qumran. The Qumran community regarded its members as children of light while it saw all others, Jews and Gentiles alike, as children of darkness. It is thus a classic instance of a sect in the sociological sense, a group that claims to have exclusive access to the truth and views everyone outside the sect as lost. Some scholars have taken the fact that the Book of the Watchers was copied by the Qumran community as an indication that it is sectarian in outlook. I believe that they are mistaken. Even as the Book of the Watchers criticizes the behavior of some priests, its description of the heavenly temple, in which some of the Watchers remain at their stations, shows that it does not condemn all priests. Furthermore, though the Ascent rests on the premise that God is most fully available in heaven, there is nothing in the work to suggest that the Jerusalem temple itself was defiled by the presence of the priests it criticizes. In the view of the Qumran community, in contrast, the Jerusalem temple was so polluted that the community would not make use of it. Nor is the eschatology of the Book of the Watchers sectarian in tone. Those who will survive the cleansing of the earth are the righteous, not the elect or the wise, or a term with a narrower focus, and eventually the original righteous, presumably Jews, will be joined by all nations. 1 Enoch 10:21. Many scholars claim that the Enoch literature, including the Book of the Watchers, stands apart from the Torah, offering revealed wisdom rather than the laws of the Torah as a guide for life. I find this claim difficult to accept. I limit my comments here to the Book of the Watchers because of the period in which it is set. The Book of the Watchers cannot make explicit reference to the Torah without engaging in anachronism. But the claim that the Torah is not central to its worldview is simply untenable. As we have seen, the Book of the Watchers makes use of traditions that stand behind the text of the Torah, but it also engages the text of the Torah for its picture of the angel's descent and Enoch's ascent. The priestly etiquette of the heavenly temple is deeply informed by the priestly source of the Torah, and the depiction of the heavenly temple draws on the Torah, as well as other biblical sources. If I am correct, the Book of the Watchers' criticism of priestly marriage practices is based on exegesis of the law of the Torah. Furthermore, at the very point at which tension between the Book of the Watchers and the Torah is clearest, the theory of the origins of evil, the editors of the Book of the Watchers work hard to reduce the tension by allowing for the integration of human sinfulness into a narrative that emphasizes angelic transgression. Some scholars have suggested that the authors of the Book of the Watchers were priests because of their admiration for the institution of the temple, the earthly replica of God's heavenly abode, and for the role of priest, and their criticism of priests who behave improperly. But the importance of the temple was recognized by virtually all ancient Jews, and just as Nehemiah, a layman, attempted to hold the high priest to the highest standards, so any pious Jew would demand that priests follow the rules laid down for them in the Torah. Thus the authors of the Book of the Watchers need not have been priests. There is one aspect of their hero's identity that the book's authors clearly did share. However, like Enoch, they were scribes. Indeed, the scribal skills demonstrate go well beyond Enoch's knowledge of how to draw up a petition. for they compose their consideration of the origins of evil and the place of human beings in the universe by drawing on a variety of pre-existing sources and traditions, making extensive use of scripture and interpreting its narratives and laws. Consideration of the authors of the Book of the Watchers also confronts us with the problem of pseudepigraphy. Why did people choose to write in the name of an ancient hero rather than in their own names? Some scholars have suggested that the authors of the apocalypses should be understood as prophets operating in an era in which prophecy was widely viewed as a thing of the past. Thus the apocalypses reflect actual prophetic experience, including trances and ascents that are attributed to ancient heroes to improve the chances that they would receive a sympathetic hearing. The internal evidence of the Book of the Watchers and of the other apocalypses seems to me to point away from such an understanding. The range of sources on which the authors drew and the care with which they arranged them suggests that they were not recording their own experiences but rather, despite their use of an ancient hero, were operating as authors usually do. The Book of the Watchers was extraordinarily influential. The story of the descent of the Watchers goes on to play a significant role in a wide range of literature in antiquity. So too Ascent becomes a central mode of receiving revelation in Jewish and Christian literature into the Middle Ages, and while the form of the journey to the ends of the earth has few imitators, its interests, especially the fate of souls after death, are an important theme in many later apocalypses. It is noteworthy, however, that the Book of the Watchers has rather little to say about the course of history and the end of the world. It clearly anticipates a final judgment, to which it alludes at a number of points, but it does little to provide its readers with a timetable of events that would allow them to locate themselves in relation to the eschaton. For that, we turn to the Book of Daniel, the fountainhead of the other stream of apocalypse.